This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you, who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were men that were dancing, creeping, and crooked, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? What's a tantalus? Or a gasogene? And what's the difference between a hansom cab and a four-wheeler?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 385, The Long Road from Maiwand. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details of the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And my, Bert, that's a nice wand you have there.
My. Well, that's what they said to Harry Potter.
Good old Harry, and he who must not be named.
Yes.
Of course, otherwise known as Voldemort. Sorry.
Cut it out.
We must not name him.
No.
You know, it strikes me that somebody should do a bit of fan fiction of Hilda Rumpole meeting Voldemort. It would be
why is that?
Because it would be he who must not be named meets she who must be obeyed. What a clash of titans that would be. Can you imagine?
I like that. Yeah, that's kind of like having antipasto with your pasta at an Italian restaurant.
Yeah, well, I like to, in the wintertime, I like to put a humidifier in my room. And on the other side of the room, I put in a dehumidifier. I let them fight it out.
Well, and other than the snow that takes place in the middle of the room, there's no real impact on anyone standing there.
Well, this is the third episode of the month, and we here in Season 8 are calling this episode, or this series of episodes, Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist. It's where we take a piece of Sherlockian scholarship from days gone by, and we share it with you because we think that our predecessors have come up with plenty of trifling observations themselves. And in this case, we're looking at, well, something of a rarity, a piece by Edgar W. Smith, who is the subject of the latest episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. This is kind of a cross-promotional show with iHose. Edgar, of course, was the first true able administrator of the Baker Street Irregulars and founded the Baker Street Journal. He had a wonderful eye for scholarship, other talented Sherlockians, and was a wonderful writer as well. And in this case, he is going to tell us all about the date of a study in Scarlet, specifically referencing Watson's war service as part of it. You'll want to make sure you are subscribed to us wherever you get podcasts, and in the show notes that you have in front of you, whether you're using YouTube or Apple Podcasts or what have you, we have links to various places, including Patreon, where you can support our show for as little as $1 a month. You can also support us over on Substack. Choose whichever platform works for you, and whatever amount works for you, we will be in your debt, because you make this show possible. Every week we do our research, we pay the hosting costs, all of the minutiae, the trifles that go into putting a podcast together. They're made possible thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. So do your part, see what you can figure out, and just join our community on either one of those platforms. Okay, now we have in our hands this lovely little pamphlet from Edgar W. Smith. Is this something that you're intimately familiar with, Bert?
Not at all. Not at all.
Perfect. Oh, this should be fun then.
Yeah, this is something that's new, I think, new to me. And as you pointed out, it's a rarity. It's something that Edgar wrote in 1940, probably printed by his own fledgling publishing effort. And I don't know that it's been reprinted anywhere else.
I don't think it has, really. Edgar had a small press he called the Pamphlet House, and he put out a number of small booklets from that. This is even smaller. This is basically a sheet of paper folded in two in quarto, printed in quarto. So you've got the title page, and then the inside cover, the inside back, and then the outside back. That's it. And we see these published by many Sherlockians for the BSI dinner, the keepsakes. And usually they're just wonderful short-form pieces of scholarship, observations, trifles, dare we say, that give us an opportunity to ponder something. So Edgar's The Long Road from Maiwand. I don't know that we want to read it word for word, although Edgar is quite a wordsmith, but why don't we cover the highlights?
Yeah, well, I think a good place to begin for our listeners is what we know about this, and that, of course, takes us to a study in Scarlet. And we can tell you in just about a minute or so that we really don't know very much at all. You know, the first words of a study in Scarlet are, in the year 1878, I took my degree of Doctor of Medicine at the University of London, And Watson then tells us he went through a course prescribed for surgeons in the Army. He was attached to the 5th Northumberland Fusiliers. He lands at Bombay. He was removed from his brigade. He serves in the fatal Battle of Maiwand. He is saved by the courage of his orderly, Murray, who brings him safely to the British lines. And he winds up at a base hospital in Peshawar and eventually finds himself, he says, landed a month later. You know, this is all described. He becomes struck down by enteric fever, the curse of our Indian possessions. And for months, he says, for months, my life was despaired of. So there's clearly a gap in between the Battle of Maiwand, which was a genuine event in the 19th century, and Watson's surviving his rigors of his illness. So it's for months my life was despaired of. I became convalescent. I was dispatched in the troop ship Orontes and landed a month later on the Portsmouth jetty with my health irretrievably ruined. And, you know, then he says he gravitated to London, more time. There I stayed for some time at a private hotel in the Strand. And he comes to a conclusion that he's got to get out of his private hotel. And then we have, on the very day I came to this conclusion, standing at the Criterion Bar, he meets Stamford and then Sherlock Holmes. So the whole idea here with Edgar's paper is, when was that exactly?
Yeah, and we are typically led to believe that Watson and Holmes met in March of 1881. Right, so you've got this action, the Battle of Maiwand, that took place on July 27th, 1880, and you know we figure, okay, well, Watson convalesces, he's on the ship, he's brought back to London, he runs out his pension, and there he runs into Sherlock Holmes. And Edgar is making the case that 1881 was, in fact, the wrong year. He said he acknowledges March the 4th. And he says, since Watson's introduction to Holmes could not have preceded the revelation, of course, of Jefferson Hope's confession. And this is and this is going to take a bit of a sidebar here. This is a note, a footnote in the piece that Lucy Ferrier, a little girl about 5 years of age, quote unquote, in 1847, would have been a ripe and appropriate 18 by August 4th, 1860, the date John Ferrier was slain. In the year of A Study in Scarlet, Jefferson Hope said she was to have married me 20 years ago. This would date A Study in Scarlet in 1880, which is preposterous. Hope's quote-unquote 20 years was obviously the approximation of an overwrought mind and might just as easily be stretched to an actual 23 as an actual 21. Okay, so that's Edgar's supposition that the revelation of Jefferson Hope's confession must have come on March the 4th, not in, well, it says in the year 1881, but therefore, since Watson's introduction to Holmes could not have preceded the revelation by more than 2 or 3 months, in itself a violently arbitrary assumption, the meeting must have taken place sometime between November 1880 and January 1881.
Well, at that point, Edgar reviews what we've already discussed, which is Watson's degree in 1878, and of course the battle occurring in 1880. And bear in mind that what he does say, as we've now looked, is for months his life was despaired of, and so on. So I think there's certainly a reasonable ground for this sort of re-examination. Edgar tells us that the course of the disease would probably have run from January 1881, run until January 1881. So the battle again, July 27, 1880, Watson's life is despaired of, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so here we have January 1881, and it's improbable, says Edgar, that he would have been allowed to depart before February or even March. So it's by January 1881 he's getting stronger, and off he goes February or March, perhaps.
And again, he's got a nice note here. He says, talking about that attack of enteric fever, which endured for months, as you said. He says, I am told by Dr. Lewis A. Hauser of the staff of the New York Hospital that the term enteric fever, which is now obsolete, was used at the time of the Afghan wars to describe intestinal fevers generally, including fever now designated as typhoid. The bacillus typhosus was not isolated by Eberth of Germany until 1880, but Dr. Hauser feels, despite the lack of facilities for accurate diagnosis available in India at the time, that Watson's malady was certainly typhoid, and he believes, from the references made, that it might well have laid him low for 3 months. 3 months. So that brings us up to that February-March time frame that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And that's just the recuperation from the disease. All right, so Edgar goes on to write, a paternal government had specified a period of 9 months for attempted recuperation of Watson's irretrievably ruined health. But this arrangement seems to have had no immediate bearing on what happened next. Gravitating to the great cesspool of London, as all loungers and idlers were wont to do, Watson arrived there no earlier, we must conclude, than the month of May 1881, a date which is 2 months later than the accepted date of that revelation of Jefferson Hope itself.
Well, there we are. It's, Edgar is doing quite an investigation in here and comes to the conclusion that the removal to Baker Street, Holmes and Watson setting up residence in Baker Street, can really scarcely be dated before autumn of 1881. And, and then he recaps January 27, 1880, the Battle of Maiwand, 1 bullet wound or 2, a convalescence, case of typhoid fever, another convalescence, a journey back to England. Could this have happened in 4 to 6 months? Physically impossible. says Edgar, even the sprightliest of mortals, which Watson was not, could scarcely have accomplished so tedious a round in less than a year. Well, so that takes us to the meeting between Holmes and Watson taking place no earlier than October or November in 1881, and then there's some time that elapses between that time and Watson's first learning the nature of his roommate's profession. And of course, we have, that is on the record from a study in Scarlet.
That's right. Yeah, weeks going by.
As happening on
March the 4th, 1882. The date of March the 4th is a fixture within whatever year is assigned to it. Edgar writes, the period of ignorance cannot have been less than the weeks to which Watson refers. The long road from Maiwand excludes a date prior to March 4th, 1881 for the meeting. Therefore, the revelation must have come on March 4th, 1882, and the meeting must have taken place long, but not too long before that date. The month of November 1881 shouts itself from the housetops in answer. I'm not hearing it as loudly and clearly as Edgar, but I mean, we've always accepted New Year's Day to be that day that Watson and Stamford met in the Criterion Bar. But
well, I think it's interesting that despite Edgar's deep scholarship, his commitment to publishing, his careful research, and the reasonable conclusions that he's drawn from the dates of the actual events, the Battle of Maiwand and so on, consulting a medical authority about how long it might take to recover from typhoid and so on. I think it's amazing that despite all that, no one has revised their chronologies to put a study in Scarlet into 1882, and yet it remains, oddly enough, a fixture of March 1881. Now how do you explain that?
It's a good question. I mean, perhaps we like to think that Watson was a little more robust than he was, although he did tell us he was a kind of a broken man by the time he got to London. Maybe we'd simply underestimate the amount of recovery time that this would have taken. I mean, Edgar consulting the eminent physician Louis Hauser, the New York hospital, about the length of enteric fever. Maybe the seriousness of enteric fever. We underestimate that. The travel time, the amount of time it took Watson to blow through his pension. I mean, when you consider all of these things together, there are lots of reasons to think about 1882. I just think 1881, it's such a familiar, comfortable, it's a number that it just looks right. 18 is the opposite of 81. It's a mirror image when you slice it down the middle. Just why ruin that?
Oh, I like that. You could put a mirror up to 18 and get 1881. Well, Edgar's conclusion here is, pretty nice. He says, this is really when John H. Watson's life really began. And the nice part about the date of 1882 is that we can say Watson was then a sober, settled man of 30. And as for Sherlock Holmes himself, despite the category of university student attributed to him by young Stamford, we have it from later evidence, he was already in his 29th year. And so it was indeed full time for the two to meet. And if either is to blame for the delay and for the denial of other tales that another year or two together might have brought, it is on Watson's head that the onus must lie for having dallied so long by the side of the road that led at last to Baker Street.
That's interesting. If Watson had known what was in store for him, I'm sure he would have hurried that meeting along. He would not have tarried in meeting Sherlock Holmes. And yet, this kind of thing was, happenstance. He did not expect himself to come to London and become a biographer of the world's first consulting detective. Makes you wonder.
Well, it does make you wonder.
Well, we will have a scan of this piece of scholarship by Edgar available for our Patreon and our Substack supporters. So again, if you'd like to join up, just go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com, and you too will have access to this piece of rare Sherlockian scholarship. And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
This chain of events is certainly of extraordinary interest.